Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Iowa City Public Library. My name is Maeve Clark, and I'm the coordinator of Information Services. No, I'm the coordinator of Adult Services here at the Iowa City Public Library. I forgot. Welcome to Weber Days at the Iowa City Public Library. During the month of May, this very cold now month of May, the library celebrates not only National Historic Preservation Month and local history, but local historian Irving B. Weber. And some of you have come to a couple of these, and so you've heard this over and over again, but it doesn't hurt. Eventually there's going to be a quiz about Irving B. Weber, and you'll win. You know all the details of his life. Irving B. Weber lived his entire life, nearly all of the 20th century, in Iowa City. His family roots reached deep into early Iowa City. His maternal great-grandparents settled in Iowa City in 1839. His paternal grandparents came in 1857. Irving was born in 1900, at the beginning of a new century. He went to Iowa City Public Schools and graduated from the University of Iowa in 1922. He's remembered for many things: University of Iowa's first All-American swimmer, founder of Quality Checked Dairies, serving as its president until his retirement in 1966. Irving was active in the Iowa City Host Noon Lions Club, and in 1994, the Irving B. Weber Elementary School was named in his honor. He may be most remembered, however, for over the 800 articles he wrote for the Iowa City Press-Citizen starting in 1973. Irving's view of history was not one of dull retelling of facts and names, but more of sharing the story of what it was like to grow up in Iowa City, the best places to buy penny candy, the joys of cooling off in Melrose Lake in the summer, sledding parties on closed-off streets. He recorded for future generations the story of Iowa City as no one else could. All of the articles Irving Weber wrote for the Iowa City Press-Citizen are available online through the University of Iowa Digital Library, a project made possible with the cooperation of the Iowa City Host Noon Lions Club, the Iowa City Public Library, and Lolly Eggers. Lolly Eggers has also written a biography of Irving B. Weber, so if you're just terribly intrigued with Irving, we've got lots more we can share with you. Irving B. Weber died in 1997, barely missing a century of life. Join us the rest of the month for more programs during Weber Days. Next Tuesday, our third to last program will be the Girl History Detectives, 6th grade girls from Lemmy School sharing their research on their school's namesake, Helen Lemmy. That will be Tuesday night in this room at 7 p.m. And there'll be ice cream afterwards, and that's in honor of Irving and his years at Quality Checked. On Wednesday, May 27th, the last Wednesday of the month, we have two more WOW programs. At noon, author and Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Director Emeritus Tim Welsh will read from his new book, Images of America, Coralville. Not quite Iowa City, but it's okay. It's still good to learn about Coralville. Our final Weber on Wednesday will be Tom Schuline. Hello, Tom. Citizen historian, retired dental professor, presenting a program on the history of Iowa City grocery stores, from the corner store to the superstore. And what an appropriate thing to end with. We've had all this food all the way along, and we're going to learn even more about grocery stores. There are, let's see, excuse me. So that will be next Wednesday, the 27th at 7 p.m. in that room, and that will be the final program for Weber on Wednesday. However, if I have piqued your interest in local history or exploring your family history, take a trip to the second floor of the library. In fact, if you're really interested in finding out about your family's history, we have one last genealogy class, this one using Ancestry.com, and there are still 4 places available, so you've got time to sign up. Upstairs, what I like to call the best floor of the Iowa City Public Library, for all you fiction readers, there is another floor at the library. There's a second floor. You can come upstairs and look at a marvelous display that was done by Friends of Historic Preservation, sharing their 40-year history. You can take part in a scavenger hunt, learn about Iowa City's historic districts, and see for yourself what downtown Iowa City looked like before urban renewal. It's very clever. The woman who designed it has a picture of what it is now, and then you'll lift up the flap and you can see what it was before. We also have printed a number of images from our digital history collection, but you don't even have to have been in the library to view them. When you're home, you can explore even more of Iowa City's history through Iowa City Public Library's digital porthole, history.icpl.org. So this, one side is a recipe that you'll learn more about tonight, and the other side is the address to our digital history portal. But before I get to our speaker tonight, I want to thank a group of people who have greatly contributed to tonight's program in our gustatory adventure in Iowa City. Historic foodies, and there's several of them out there, and they're responsible for the food in the back, are a book of cookbook and culinary group of cookbook and culinary explorers. It's a small group looking to add others to the fun, so you're welcome to come next Wednesday night, 6 o'clock, meeting room D, and then after you spend time with historic foodies, you can come in here and learn about grocery stores. So it's all one big food-related evening. They've been meeting for about 2.5 years, and the idea was started by staff at Special Collections at the University of Iowa Libraries, and they have an incredible cookbook collection, maybe the best cookbook collection in the world at the University of Iowa Libraries. And then staff at Old Capitol Museum. Each meeting, they pick a theme, research it, make a dish at home, and share the experiences and the dish at the meeting. So you're sort of doing the same thing here, but you don't even realize you're part of Historic Foodies. So you're all temporary members, but you can become full members very easily. Their next meeting, as I said, is Wednesday the 27th at 6 p.m., meeting room D, and it's free. And the Historic Foodies tonight contributed recipes from this book, which is a 1898 cookbook that the Iowa City Public Library has in our storage reference collection, and it's all scanned and it's all on history.icpl.org. So I know you're going to want to go home and make these recipes and try and figure out what temperature to bake them at, because there are no temperatures in them, how much sugar to add to that punch, because there's no directions for sugar, so it might be too sweet because I just kept pouring the sugar in. So it's a fascinating look at Iowa City, and it also has wonderful ads that go along with it. So that's something for you to look at when you get home tonight. But back to the matter at hand. I've been eagerly awaiting tonight's program, The Food History of Iowa City from 1830, let's see, 9 years before Irving Weber's great-grandparents arrived in Iowa City. See, I've now memorized that piece of information. Our speaker tonight is Rachel Wobeter. Rachel is the Event Services Manager at the National Czech and Slovak Museum, a brand new full-time job for her. Congratulations, Rachel. She is also working on her Museum Studies certificate at the University of Iowa. She graduated from Luther College in 2009 with a degree in anthropology and a minor in environmental studies. From a very young age, Rachel has been interested in food, growing food, cooking food, and entertaining her friends around a full table of food. I think we should all get to know Rachel a little bit better. Her professional career in food started after college when she worked for a CSA farm in Decorah. From there, she worked for 2 years with the Northeast Iowa Food and Fitness Initiative, focusing on developing farm-to-school programs in 20 school districts. Rachel left this position to travel and eat her way through Europe. Now, doesn't that sound wonderful? After returning in 2013, she started working as the local food program manager at the Center for Energy and Environmental Education at UNI in Cedar Falls, and helped develop a sustainable local food system in the surrounding 6 counties. In August 2014, she began her Museum Studies certificate at Iowa and was thrilled to have an internship developing programming for The Land Provides, Iowa's culinary heritage at the Old Capitol Museum. The internship was the genesis of tonight's research presentation. Please help me welcome Rachel.
Hello. Well, I am honored to be here. Irving Weber was very helpful when I was doing my research to learn about Iowa City's food history, and I am overwhelmed with all of his information. If you see his volumes like stacked up, it's like this high. And here's my little stack, and it took me a whole semester. So he obviously is a tremendous asset to this community, really irreplaceable for saving the Iowa City history. So I'm glad to be here. So a little bit about, she kind of explained why I'm here. I decided to go into the museum world and did an internship at the Old Capitol Museum. And let's see, I can learn how to click these. Okay. So food has always been my passion. Then there's some museums on the side. They're starting to creep in. And I went on a walking food tour when I was in New York City, in Harlem. That's me over there, and loved this idea of bringing history together. I learned about the long and very fascinating history of Harlem. We got to stop at restaurants along the way, and then, you know, we were in a tour of 10 or 12 other people, and we got to know each other. Surprisingly, most of the people on the tour actually live in New York City, but had never been to Harlem. So living in silos there. So it was a great experience for me, and I did that trip in 2014 in the summer and had wanted to figure out how to do a walking food tour ever since. And so when I realized I could do this internship to help with, there's an image there of the Land Provides Iowa's Culinary Heritage, I just thought I would ask if I could do some outreach programming. That's kind of my favorite thing to do with museums, is take them outside the museum doors, the information and everything that a museum has to provide. And of course, they were pleased that I would want to do something like that. And then as I started developing and researching what my food tour would be, I realized it'd be more than just entertainment. It's also a way for people to learn about how food used to be grown and how it used to be eaten, and really reconnect with food. These days, it's very easy for people here in the United States to not have a clue where their food was grown. It just appears on their kitchen table or it appears on the restaurant table, and we really don't know much about it. And so I just think this is a good way to kind of slow down and think more about what we're eating. But it was also very romantic to learn about how food, how people ate back in this era. Some things were more sophisticated than I would have expected. And of course, a lot of their stuff was local. For a good portion of this era, you know, we didn't even have trains coming to Iowa City, so they literally had to grow, cook, do everything for the food that they were eating. So that was, for a foodie, that's very fun to learn about. And then I wanted to just let you know a little bit about how I found this information. I used the Iowa City Public Library's history website. They have images, they have links to different ads and articles and books, so I used that. The University of Iowa's library has a section about Iowa City. And then I just looked at a lot of cookbooks and newspapers. They have ads in the back, and they would say, you know, a restaurant on Clinton Street between, Washington and Iowa, and it's like, okay, there's a restaurant there. What did it serve? And then I just would go down a rabbit hole and come out 5 hours later and find out, what that restaurant's name was. So it was a long process, because honestly, people were not recording their food history at that point. They're just trying to eat. So it wasn't like I got to open an encyclopedia and just find out what was in Iowa City during this era for their food establishments. Let's see. Okay. So I want to kind of just get us in the right environment. I said this presentation kind of starts in 1830. And in 1830, basically, Iowa was entirely inhabited by Native Americans. There were a few European traders kind of scattered about, but it was mostly Native Americans. And it was just after 1830 when the European Western movement started to hit Iowa. And this map kind of just shows you where some of the different tribes were. But by 1860, approximately, basically all of Iowa was inhabited by the European settlers. And it was, so with this 30-year period, the landscape actually had a huge transition. It went from, mostly kind of a hunting and gathering, maybe some subsistence farming that the Native Americans did, but quickly the Europeans did more of a monoculture, just more large-scale farming. So the landscape changed a lot during this time. I would love to spend time learning about the Native American foodways. I didn't, but I think it's a really, really important part of Iowa City's history. Sometimes people say you have to go to Europe, kind of to dig even further back and have older history, but we have the old history. We have the Native Americans. So that is for another presentation, another time. But I do want to just kind of set the scene a little bit. It wasn't a good time for the Native Americans when they were getting pushed out of their homes. And there was a quote from one of the Iowa City history books from Chief Power Sheik, which would have been just right around here. in Iowa City, and he wrote that, just kind of a quote to the white people. "Soon I shall go to a new home, and you will plant corn where my dead sleep. Our towns, the paths we have, and the flowers we love will soon be yours." So kind of a recognition that, they can no longer be there anymore. So the European settlers, we have land for sale, and it got eaten up very quickly. The population here in Iowa City in 1840 was 520, and let me see where my dates are. Iowa City was founded in 1839 on May 4th. It was declared the territorial capital in 1842, and then Iowa, of course, became a state in 1846, just to kind of position you here. So in 1840, the population was 520. 5 years later, it was 1,000. It doubled. And then in 1850, we had almost 1,600 people here in Iowa City. And then in 1855, we were around 5,000. So this early population development, pretty rapid development, has a lot to do with the fact that it was the capital for a short time. And the people that were coming here, their birthplaces were listed most commonly from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. Some of the earliest nationalities of people, there were Irish, German, and Scottish. And then, of course, in 1840s, we had the Czech and Slovak immigration here, which I'll talk a little bit later about Goosetown, a really prominent neighborhood during this era in Iowa City. And I'm very proud about the Czechs and the Slovaks. I'm 75% Czech, and I work at the Czech Museum, and so that's been an interesting part for me to learn about. So just a little tidbit about this population growth, Iowa City becoming a place. We, of course, had food celebrations. I mean, that's what people have done for centuries, is celebrate with food. And so I found a little anecdote that on July 4th in 1839, right after Iowa City was founded, there was a celebration on the lawn of the Pentacrest right in front of the old Capitol. And there, there's still a lawn there, so you can really still picture this quite well. But they say that dozens of pioneer families came from surrounding little villages, turned over boxes, and just had a picnic and celebrated this new city. And so I did a walking food tour. I kind of forgot to describe that, but I did walking food tours of this information in April, and we started at the old Capitol, and I kind of got to describe the scene that they would have seen in 1839 there. And people still have picnics there. I've seen students hanging around, so not many things have changed there in the Pentacrest. Okay, so we have all these people coming, and there really wasn't much here, there wouldn't have been a lot of buildings, there wouldn't have been many homes, and so this might be an interesting place to start. It's called a tavern. It also could be called an inn, but really this is where the first people were hanging out when they got to Iowa City. Would have been in one of two places, the Allen Andrews Tavern, which is on Brown Street. It's still there. And then also Lean Back Hall, which I'll talk about in a moment. But what I really discovered with taverns, or inns, is that they're essentially converted homes with liquor licenses. And these taverns or inns were, even on the East Coast, even coming into New York City, I was reading that they were the first friendly moments of socializing when they first came to the United States. Were these inns and taverns. So they're kind of the hub for people when they first came over. And I guess people started thinking that was the American way to do things, was to go to an inn or a tavern and hang out and socialize. And oftentimes people would build the inns and taverns next to the city hall, kind of meeting hall. So they always had this very central aspect to communities during this time. And so I keep referring to it as an inn or a tavern, and honestly they were one and the same. A tavern or an inn might have a little market, it was a trade center, might provide entertainment, it had sleeping quarters, it had food, and it had alcohol. It had all of these things, because again, this was one of 2 or 3 buildings for a little while. So they really had to be very all-purpose. So Leanback Hall is where the senior center on Lynn Street, more or less, used to be located. And Leanback Hall, they say, was put up in 1839. And the reason it's called Leanback Hall, so this building would have only had one bedroom, a kitchen, and then kind of this dining bar hall. And the one lodging room would have held 36 men. And so you wonder, how can one bedroom hold 36 men? I suppose if you're drunk enough, it doesn't really matter. But they would have kind of a long board along the wall, and then the men would just lean back on it. So it's called Leanback Hall. So these accommodations were not very, very good, and I think it just kind of shows the struggles of the westward movement. I mean, nothing was luxurious. They were just looking for a better life, and I think oftentimes moving west, of course, without their families, so it was just a lot of men. So some of the things as they developed, this photo was taken in 1853. There are very few photos that go much before 1840. But Clinton Street really was the prime street in Iowa City to start with, which makes sense. It's right in front of the Capitol. So this is an image of Clinton Street. It's kind of a sketch more so. And I was able to find a list of the businesses in 1840, and it said there were 3 or 4 brick buildings. There were, and several more in progress, they said. There were 10 dry goods stores or grocers, a drugstore, a saddlery, 2 blacksmiths, 1 gunsmith, coffee house, 4 lawyers, 3 physicians, 1 church, and 1 primary school in 1840 in Iowa City. I love that they had coffee. I mean, coffee, it's amazing how important that's been to people over the centuries. I actually have a book on coffee houses, and it goes back to when they started in Turkey. They have a very ancient history. So Iowa City is no exception there. Okay, so before I started, well, I decided on this time period because it matched the exhibit in the Old Capitol Museum. And I wanted this to go along with that. But I didn't realize I was going to be really researching one of the most pivotal times in food history ever in the United States. And so the reason it was so pivotal, well, the United States had this huge territorial expansion over this time. So all the different diversity that brought. We had a lot of different food technologies being developed. Refrigeration and canning and all these sorts of things were getting their starts at this time. We also had transportation developments that all happened around here, so with the trains making it to, across the country, which made it easy to ship foods for the first time, or animals. The waterway travel, the canals and rivers, we had steamboats that were developed, were getting used more during this time. Roads just being built better. So all of those things contributed to the food environment as well during this time. And then because we had this industrialization, we had people moving from rural to urban locations. And so whereas farming and gardening would have been the way primarily everyone would have eaten in 1830, by the end, we had the need for grocery stores and markets and other places for people to buy their food because they were living in urban settings now. So a lot of this was kind of, these changes had to do with necessity. Some didn't. People just started to like getting oranges in December. So really what we have here, 1830 was pure like self-sufficiency. The people that would have been living in Iowa City. And then by 1900, we really had a consumerist kind of foodway. And the other thing that developed around this time was a national, a national food culture. At the start of this, until probably 1850 and 60, everyone kept to their regional and traditional cooking ways, wherever they had come from, whatever European country they had immigrated from. They kept those traditions. But by 1900, enough mixing and homogenization had happened, and modernization, that we started to kind of have this national food culture. So I was just really impressed to learn how much happened in this time period. And also, consumption as a social activity kind of came out of this time. People would be eating in their homes and drinking in their homes, and everything was in their homes. And now restaurants really started to develop towards the end of this era as well, and the taverns, ice cream parlors, and soda shops. That was the word I was thinking of. And that actually, I could have gone back to that, but that actually is a sketch of a steamboat on the river here in Iowa City. And then, yeah, I'm just going to read a little bit just so you get an idea. This is a description from about 1840 of what a dweller in a log cabin here in Iowa City would have had available to eat. And it's pretty impressive. So they had wheat bread, cornbread, butter, eggs, corn, flapjacks, batter cakes, hominy, rice, potatoes, pumpkin, dried apples, dried peaches, chicken, turkey, duck, prairie chicken, venison, ham, bacon, spare ribs, dried beef, and mackerel, berries, cake, pies, crackers, cheese, nuts, molasses, honey, sugar, milk, tea, and coffee. So not too shabby, you know. I would take that. So a lot of my presentation is going to focus on well, not the home life, more the public life in food environments. But I did want to touch briefly on what people would have been doing in their homes here in Iowa City. And this sketch is, it's not a historical sketch of Goosetown, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Goosetown, and those are the little street signs in Goosetown. And of course, this was settled by the Czechs and Slovaks, as I mentioned before, and they were fleeing their native land, which was under the very cruel reign of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they had very few possessions, but a lot of hope and a lot of skills when they came here to Iowa City, and so they actually thrived and were very prosperous. What you would see if you were in Iowa City when they were first settling in the 1870s would have been gardens. Basically every front yard, backyard had a garden. And if you do head to Goosetown, I guess I should maybe describe that. The northeast side kind of Iowa City next to, if anyone has a better way to describe it, I'm not good with streets, kind of next to Oakland Cemetery. You can still go there today. I like to take little walks, and you can still kind of see how the community used to be set up. But the homes are really small. And Marlon Ingalls took me on a tour, and he told me that they would keep it small, and then if their family expanded or they needed a reason to kind of build and expand, they just would do little additions. So they kind of look hodgepodge, these buildings. They're just very practical. Us Czech people were very practical. So they didn't want to build a new house, they just were going to add on. So the Czech people would have had root cellars, was a very common aspect to their food lives, and they'd store fruit barrels, sauerkraut, pickles, preserves, cheese, and other food in the root cellars. There's also some rumor that the Underground Railroad would have kind of participated with some of these underground cellars. Smokehouses were really common for the Czech people. They liked the flavor of smoked meat, and so there are still, I guess, some smokehouses still standing. They don't have their implements inside of them, but they probably are a garden shack now. But I learned that by 1890, when Hormel, the meat company, started to nationalize, then these smokehouses went out of use because they could just buy their meat smoked. And so the reason they're called, it's called Goosetown, I learned, is that they were raising a lot of geese. They just kind of were hanging out in the streets and in the alley. And also, the geese were really central to the Czech culture. They would eat the geese, of course, for their meat. They'd use the fat for cooking, but also they would put different herbal or different herbs in it and make different salves. And it was cheaper than trying to find oil and trying to buy salve. They could use the geese fat. They also could use the feathers to to make a pastry brush, which they would brush, egg white or butter onto their baked goods or kolaches. And then they could use the feathers to build, well, not to build, but to make pillows and blankets to keep warm. So these geese were used in a variety of ways. And also, someone recently told me that geese, well, I know this, but geese are very, they're kind of mean, and they're very territorial. And so I guess a lot of people weren't outsiders weren't going into Goosetown because the geese were kind of the watchdogs for the community. I don't know, that's not a very friendly side of them, but I guess that works. So then another community that is just now starting to get researched, and we still don't have a lot of answers, is Hubbard Park. And this area is down south by the, not south, but west by the river by the Iowa Memorial Union. It's just a big lawn now. And so when they were doing the flood mitigation and restoration, and they were kind of doing some digging around, they started to find some artifacts down there. And they realized that it was a community that had been lived in, I mean, even in the 1850s, and then again, it kind of had a renewal after the turn of the century. And this is an image from 1888 to 1895. In this community, like I said, it's still kind of under-researched, but they think it was a pretty ethnically mixed community, very working-class neighborhood. So there would have been a lot of black people living there, and that is a part of the history in Iowa City that we actually don't know a lot about. And so they're looking forward to, they've collected a ton of artifacts from there, a lot of kitchen utensils and bowls. I got to go down during one of their excavations and watch them, like shovel by shovel, start to uncover like a bowl, which is very exciting, even though it's just a bowl. But so I'm looking forward to seeing what they kind of put together from that. And that's another aspect, really, of the food history that I didn't get a lot of, is how kind of each ethnicity, what kind of food traditions they had. I kind of just got what would have been the advertised in kind of the public food way. So there is an image from the sky of Hubbard Park, which all of those red boxes would have been homes and little businesses. And in the southeast corner, so the kind of the furthest corner from me down in the bottom, was a grocery store called Ranella Grocery, and it was used 1911 to 1915. And I have an image of it. It's the one it's the building right here at this V. It's like a grocery store. I know I'm not supposed to leave my mic. So this communities really tried to be self-sufficient. So, you know, Goosetown probably tried to have people who could, maybe they had blacksmiths and they had butchers. Each community kind of tried to have enough of things there so they didn't have to be heading downtown or traveling too far to get all their needs met. And so hotels, I'm going to take it quick. Crummy, and they truly were crummy. It's kind of hilarious that there's something such a perfect name. So hotels, I talked a little bit about the inns and the taverns being kind of the first hub of culture and food and drink here in Iowa City. But eventually, the city got a little bit bigger and they actually had something we might call a hotel, but they were still mostly converted homes, people who agreed to like have a little area for a stranger to sleep in. And they got served poor food, and it might just be a pile of straw, really, for them to lay in. But what I learned when I was researching hotels in general was that the reason they were first conceived here in the United States, I don't know how they kind of developed in Europe, but was to control strangers. So you think of Iowa City, they're starting to get a community of people, 500, 600 people, and they still have this constant westward movement. All of these people going through their community, strangers, who knows, if they're good, if they're bad, what their intentions are. And so these people had no place to go, so they decided, okay, let's find a place to control them, and so we know at least where they are. And so that's why these initial hotels were not luxurious. They weren't trying to please the guests. That was just so they could know where they were and kind of control them and supervise them, which I thought was really interesting. I had never thought about that. And then eventually they started to get a little more comfortable, and they were still really cheap. So like I said, they weren't going to make this too expensive for the strangers to sleep in. It was either free or it was, didn't cost much. Well, once they got a little more comfortable, actually the local people started wanting to just live in hotels instead of live in their house because they had someone to cook for them and clean, and they didn't have to do any work. So society around that time actually started to think hotels were a bad thing, because it gave people too much free time, and they're able to drink too much because they're just hanging out in the hotels. And there's actually kind of a gender issue happening, because wives were never supposed to be socializing out in public. They couldn't drink in public. We'll talk about that later. But they were. These hotels kind of allowed them into the man's world, and the men didn't like that. So this is actually a hotel here in Iowa City. It was located, I don't know if I have the, no, I don't have that address, but I think it was on Washington Street. And yeah, CRUMMEY. So eventually, by 1880, we did get to the point where we realized that hotels could be a way to attract people to come to our community and to spend money, and it's kind of an economic benefit. And so James Hotel, or St. James Hotel, which is a very famous hotel during this era, is there on the corner. Of course, this picture is from the Iowa City cupola looking down at Iowa Avenue, and then there on the right is St. James Hotel. It's not there anymore. It burned down in 1916. But James Rush Hartsock built this in 1872, and he eventually became the mayor of Iowa City. And in 1872, it was $2 a night to stay in the hotel, and all the rooms were heated, which was a very big deal. And the meal that was served, I don't know exactly what day, but in 1872, a meal that was served in their restaurant was consisted of clear consommé, fruit cup, a fish course, beef Wellington, which was the feature of the St. James Hotel, potatoes au gratin, Brussels sprouts with hollandaise sauce, Waldorf salad, hot rolls, coffee with rich cream, and apple pie with a wedge of cheddar cheese. So, another lovely meal. I love the restaurants here, but seriously, I don't know if I could get that meal right now. So, this was a hotel, like I said, started in 1872, and then in 1814, it got transitioned into the Iowa City bookstore, or the University bookstore. Then in 1916, it burned down, they rebuilt it, and it's still today the Iowa City, or University of Iowa bookstore. This is another street image with the St. James Hotel being the first building you see there. That was taken in 1895, looking south on Clinton Street. And then in 1915, a year before it would have burned down, there it is as the University bookstore. Iowa Book and Supply. Okay, thank you. So I mentioned this was a very pivotal time in food history. One reason was because of transportation development, and Iowa City, the railroad reached Iowa City in 1855, and that brought a lot of changes. One, finally the citizens of Iowa City could be traveling any time of year, which was a luxury. Also, even at this time, Iowa was known as an agricultural leader, or a state leader in the country for agriculture, and they were now able to get their dairy and meat products and grain products, primarily. Those are the three things that they could ship them out of Iowa. And then, of course, they were able to bring in other foods. They also were bringing back farm technology, salt, and then ready-made clothes, a lot of things they weren't able to get before that. Oh yeah, and of course they were, when I said grain, but corn was a primary export at that time. I guess I was just surprised to know that even then we were known for our agriculture, but of course our land is so good that it makes sense. So here's, we're gonna dive in a little bit into what you would see if you were downtown Iowa City for food establishments. And city directories were a wonderful asset for me. They listed all the businesses, and they listed people and what their professions were. So I was able to look at the 1868 city directory, and I listed every single food establishment or food-related business, and there were 6 bakeries. And this actually really is just taking into account kind of the downtown Iowa City area. This isn't like over in Coralville, because Coralville really wasn't developed like it is now. This is really just downtown Iowa City. There were 6 bakeries, 3 breweries, 20 grocers, 4 butchers, 2 butter and eggs, I guess that's just it, 8 hotels, an ice cream saloon, 7 restaurants, and 18 saloons. So things haven't really changed. Someone asked, not for the saloons part, for everything else, things have changed. I want a bakery. I want grocery stores, lots of grocery stores. But someone asked me, they said, well, what's the ratio now? How many saloon or bars are there now? And I'm like, not sure, but they're probably just around the same thing. So then there on your left are some ads that I did pull from newspapers coming from food establishments. This is a bakery. And a lot of the ads talked straight to the students. It was great. This one's saying, students, remember, we keep fresh bread and pies and cakes on hand. And students and others wishing the best baked bread, give him a call. So the ads were actually pretty funny. They're different ways to entice people. I'm just going to show you a few images. There's a KIMBALL, STEBBINS, and MEYER meat market. That was the first building in this image on your right. And they had like 3 different locations in Iowa City. The same group, the same business had 3 different markets.
That would be the Atlas restaurant now.
On your right? On your right? Yep. Exactly. This is Dubuque Street, right. And an interesting thing, I don't think it's in the rest of my presentation, but Iowa City wasn't paved, the streets weren't paved until 1895. So if you're ever looking at images and you're wondering kind of when that was taken, if it's paved, it was after 1895, and it was before, before 1895. Yeah, bricks, not paved necessarily. Here are just a few more ads. This is the Clinton Street Ice Cream Parlor. That wasn't too far from the St. James Hotel on the ground level there. Noel Bakery was a really famous bakery, and it changed names, let's see, in 1888 to Namer's Bakery. But it was famous for its snowflake bread, which any historic foodie, if you want to help me out, I don't know what snowflake bread is, but that was their specialty, and people would stop by the bakery before they'd head out to go, travel, or they're going to go visit someone else, and that was kind of their hostess gift. And I guess it was a very beautiful shop. They had walnut tables with marble tops, and then they would be making ice cream as well in their basement with crushed ice and rock salt, which sounds lovely. Let's see.
Why did all of these places advertise oysters as well as ice cream?
Yep, she asked, why are all of these restaurants, I don't know how to go back on my, actually, there you go. When you look at some of these ads, they're talking about oysters. And so her question was, why are they talking about oysters? And they really are. It's in bold letters all over the place. You can see oysters. And that is just a fantastic transition, because my next thing is oysters, because I had the same reaction to this. I didn't know that people were eating oysters in this era. And so when I started realizing that myself, I kind of thought it might be a joke or not real. Because how in the heck can they get oysters when maybe there wasn't even a train here yet, if it was before 1855. And so I did a lot of research into oysters. And what I learned that nationwide, by 1850, basically every major town in the United States had oyster bars. It was just the most popular, cheap food. And it was so popular that you could just walk into an establishment and say, give me 6. And that meant 6 fresh oysters on the half shell. We're not talking pickled or baked or grilled or fried. These were fresh oysters. So I started to ask myself, how would they get these? And before the railroad, oysters were coming from the East Coast, Chesapeake Bay primarily, and would make their way into the Midwest with stagecoach. They'd put a big block of ice or big chunks of ice and keep them alive the whole time, because of course we know they're only good if they are still alive. So I don't know how you manage to have a cheap oyster if you're having to do that whole transportation, but it was a huge detriment to the environment, because Chesapeake Bay I said in 1850, there was kind of their peak. Every single town would have an oyster bar. By 1890, Chesapeake Bay was completely devastated. They had no oysters left. So it was not a sustainable foodway there. And what I also learned that oysters have been really important to a lot of different cultures. And I read that even the Romans would get oysters shipped, well, not shipped, but just transported from Brittany, kind of the northwest part of France. Even in their time, they were getting fresh oysters. So this isn't a new thing. The people go to the ends of the world to get fresh oysters. I also learned that Abraham Lincoln, when he was campaigning, gave oyster parties. So it's just another example of how popular they were. And I don't know if you've ever heard the saying that you need to eat oysters during months with the letter R. I don't know if you've heard that, but one of the reasons is that they will be fresher if it's not super hot out. So if it's in the summer, it's August, it'd be harder to get that oyster to you fresh because it'd just be so hot and melt all the ice. Also, if it was colder, the oysters would become fatter, and so then they'd be more flavorful. So that's a tip. Here is another ad for stouts, which was, let's see, oh, Iowa Avenue. Yep, in 1880, or I guess it's 1893. But here, again, you can see, what does it say? Oysters in all styles. And so I was able to locate 3 oyster bars and find their exact location. A lot of times the ads would not be super specific. They just say Iowa Avenue. This image, you can see that's the Capitol there, so it's looking west on Iowa Avenue. But I found one oyster bar in 1863, and it is located where DC's is now, which is the Ped Mall. If Dubuque Street continued into the Ped Mall, it's kind of where that coffee shop used to be in the corner, but it would have been where DC's is, so you could have got oysters there. There was the Peter A. Heine's Oyster Eating House and Beer Saloon, and that was located on Clinton Street, basically where Midwest One Bank is. There was an oyster bar there. And there was a wine and oyster saloon, which sounds lovely, where on Washington in 1868 as well, where the Zephyr Printing and Design is. So rarely was I able to actually really find the exact locations for these restaurants, and rarely did I find images too. But okay, so we talked a little bit about inns and taverns and the hotels, and now we're going to talk about grocery stores. This is a really common image I've seen when I've been looking in the different sources. I got to go fast here. Lewis Grocery Store, and that was on Clinton Street. The very first grocery store is where Sheraton Hotel is located today, and it was called Buck Grocery. And the owner's name was Henry Buck, and he had a pair of deer antlers above the doorway to his grocery store. And so the grocery store environment, there was a lot of bartering happening. Farmers would bring in produce and exchange it for the dry goods. You know, these grocery stores weren't just food. They really were general stores providing all sorts of different items. And so people would bring in food and get dry goods or other supplies. Women were allowed to work in grocery stores. It was one of few occupations the women could do beyond school teaching or being a teacher. People would often shop frequently or daily because, of course, they didn't have refrigeration at home or just ice boxes. And I learned that store owners would like to head to the big city every once in a while and kind of check on prices because they'd get things shipped to them, sold at a certain price, but they really didn't know if they're getting, you know, a bad deal, if these people were ripping them off. And so the store owners would head to Chicago, for instance, and check on prices, and then also get to learn about what news was happening across the country, and they'd come back to Iowa City and then be able to share that information. So this is kind of a connection to the outside world. This is, of course, John's Grocery. It was built, 1848, and it was built as a grocery store by Samuel Baker, who was essentially the pioneer merchant of Iowa City. And it was a grocery store for 40 years, and then it was a saloon. And it was a tied house, and I learned what a tied house was. That meant that they could only sell, or they had to primarily sell one brewery's beer. And for that commitment, I think they might have been given some money to get that saloon going. But it was a very contradictory time, because right at this time that it turned into a saloon was when the 3 breweries that were just down the block were being established in Iowa City, or they'd been established before, but they happened at the same time. And of course, this Tide House, the saloon, could only sell beer from their distributor, and so the breweries got quite frustrated, and so they created their own beer, one of them, and they called it Erlanger, the beer that made Milwaukee jealous. So they were tied to the Pabst Milwaukee brewery, so Pabst Blue Ribbon as we know it now. That was the brewery that they were tied to. Kind of missed that part, and so that's why this little motto says, the beer that made Milwaukee jealous. So just a few other businesses. There was the Boyner Fry Company, which is there at the corner of, what is this, Washington and Gilbert, and they produced vanilla extract, which I think would be a great thing to have being produced. They did a lot of other toiletries as well, but vanilla extract is one of them. We had an ice business, of course. This is an 1860 photo. Fink's Bazaar, which was right below the St. James Hotel. It was a really popular place during this time. We had a China store, and this man in the front, he just looks very upset. I just love this photo. He looks very stern. And there's the inside of that China store. A celebration, again, food and celebrating. I just wanted to show you a few things of the general life ways at this time. Barrel rolling. That sounds, we could bring that back, I think. So saloons, can I go 5 more minutes? Or okay. Again, a very central part of life, and especially for the Czechs and Germans. And the Czechs and Germans were the ones who owned the 3 breweries we'll talk about next. So this is a picture of Dubuque Street, and there were 9 saloons just between Iowa Avenue and Washington Street in 1868. So the saloon life, really, people sometimes drank beer instead of water because it was more safe. There was definitely a tradition of taking a pail to the breweries in the morning and filling it up with beer and taking it back and just having it sit in their kitchen all day, and that's what they would drink from. Women, like I mentioned, were not able to drink in public, but they were able to get around that. They could buy rose water or toilet waters from the general stores, which were alcohol, but they were kind of infused with, I'm not sure how they were infused, but they smelled good. So the women might put it, on their wrist, and then they would drink some. And that was how they were able to get a little inebriated themselves. So they had to do it in their own, they had to do it in their bedrooms, though. So it was a very hidden thing. There were no seats in saloons. They figured if you were too drunk to stand, that you shouldn't be drinking anymore. So if you see images inside of these, you'll see no seats. The breweries. So one more thing about saloons that is food related is that there's the saying that says there's no such thing as a free lunch. However, that is not true. During this time, saloons would provide free lunches, and it was just kind of snacks, but sometimes they got more sophisticated, and it really was a way to keep men, from leaving to go have to get food. And they wanted to kind of keep them there all day, and there's some accounts that say people didn't leave them for a couple days. So I don't really want to know what that conversation was like when they went home to their wives and be like, where have you been? And be like, I don't know, was that working in the fields too long? I don't know what you would say when you're gone for a couple days. But these free lunches lasted for quite a while. They might start at 9 or 11 in the morning, and people could eat them all day, and they were free. And I found that the best free lunches you could get in the country were in New Orleans. And of course, they have a really great drinking culture still to this day, and great food. But I did find I can't find it here in my notes, but I saw a list of what was provided in Sioux City for a free lunch. And they had oysters served in 3 different ways, and they had soup and egg salad, and a whole huge offering. And so what I really learned from this is that the prices that they charge for their alcohol, those margins, they earned a ton of money off of selling alcohol, so the food was just kind of a no-brainer. If they knew it made people happy and it could keep people in the breweries, they had no problems doing that. Oh. So the breweries that I keep mentioning, only one is still standing, Union Brewery. It's Brewery Square, which is on the corner of Market and Lynn Street. There is one that is in the parking lot between, it's on Market Street. It's between kind of the building that has Teaspoons in it, or now it's High Grounds, and then where El Bandido's is, there's a parking lot there. The top of that brewery got just demolished, and there's still the caves underneath. There are still the caves in the Union Brewery, and then the other brewery was right across the street between George's and the Bluebird Diner, so there's a parking lot there. And actually, apparently the city has to keep filling in that parking lot because it kind of keeps dipping down into the beer caverns. And the reason they had these underground caverns, that was the easiest way to have temperature control when they're brewing their beer and storing the beer. And then, of course, there were all sorts of underground tunnels, so they actually could roll their barrels of beer down to the tavern, you know, down on Dubuque Street or down into downtown. So I think there's a lot of benefits to that, but they're still there. And the brewery owners were all, like I said, actually they were kind of known as the German beer mafia. And they had kind of the highest standing in the community. They provided a ton of jobs. They gave jobs to people to brew beer, to make the barrels that the beer was in, to ship the beer, to bottle the beer, to load the carts. And so they were known as really being the wealthiest people and the largest employers in town. The time each one was built, 1850s, mid-1850s is when they were built. And then, of course, you've maybe heard about the beer riots. It's a dark part of Iowa City's history. In 1882, the state of Iowa decided they wanted to outlaw alcohol. And then it wasn't until July 4th in 1884 that the laws went into effect. And now these brewery owners were left with thousands of gallons of beer that no one could drink. And really, for the Czechs and the Germans, they didn't understand this. Beer was a central part of their life, and so they didn't see why they had to stop. And so they did. They continued serving beer. A week later, they got issued warnings that they ripped up right in front of the sheriff's face, and so they got citations and were asked to go to court a month later. And then a month later on their court date, they went to the county justice's house. They had built up a mob of nearly 200 people, started fights. There was tarring. They had guns. I didn't have any accounts of them actually shooting people, but they were shooting in the house of the county justice and throwing stones. So this mob went on through the whole night, and actually nothing really happened to these men. One of the brewery owners was John Englert, of course, of the kind of the dynasty, of the Englert dynasty here in Iowa City, and he was a city councilman. So one of the brewery owners was a city councilman, and the sheriffs were not wanting to make him mad. And so after all of these fights, tons of damage, the county justice actually had a pretty bad injury to his leg. They ended up getting a fine for $7,000 in their time, which is equivalent to about $165,000 today. And that didn't even faze the brewers. They just kind of threw him the money and said, it's fine, you can have it. But this really was kind of the end of the breweries. Then we went into Prohibition, and the breweries were no longer really in use. They tried to use them to bottle soda, but the conditions weren't right, and so things kind of fermented wrong and got moldy, and so they just went out of use. And finally, we're going to get to our refreshments soon, and I know punch is one thing on the menu for you tonight, and kind of coming out of this beer riots and talking about Prohibition, I wanted to mention 2 drinks that I came across. Haymaker's Punch, also known as Switchel, and this was made out of molasses, cider vinegar, ginger, and water. And this concoction is really famous, actually can go back again into like the Roman times. And this mixture really is kind of like a natural Gatorade. It has a lot of electrolytes, and it's called haymaker's punch because in 1812, even up into the 1900s, well, 1812, that's really specific. I have a specific account from there. But really during this whole century, this was a popular drink for people who would be working hard out in the heat. They had this belief that you shouldn't drink a liquid that's different than the temperature that you're working in. So if it was really hot, they didn't think you should drink cold water. Doctors even thought it would be like lethal, like you shouldn't drink ice water. And so this mixture was actually kind of, the ginger was spicy and kind of had this heat about it. And the vinegar was tangy, and they wouldn't refrigerate it, but they would just take a jug of it, kind of shake it up with them out to the field, and then drink it throughout the day. And it really did provide some good nutrients. I also learned that it was one of a Harvard student's favorite drinks from 1830 to 1840. And the reason why this is important to the temperance movement and prohibition is that this was really a nice transition from alcohol because they still had that zing and that flavor and the kind of the bubbly carbonation that they could have gotten from alcohol or beer, and this kind of stood in its place. And just so you know, I did help a restaurant here in town. The Clinton Street Social Club is now serving kind of its cousin is called Shrub. It's the same mixture, just with vinegar, and they are now making a cocktail out of it there. So you can relive some real Iowa City history by going there and drinking one of those cocktails. That is it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So we have time for a couple of questions before we have some refreshments from the Iowa City Cookbook from 1898, and there are no recipes that have any alcohol in it for punch. And so just before we start, the recipe that I brought is a punch from Mrs. Borner, who you showed the pictures of. Her husband was a pharmacist as well. And there are several ads in the cookbook which you can read the entire cookbook online at history.icpl.org and make these recipes. There are a couple of other cookbooks in that collection, but it's a fascinating picture of Iowa City right at the turn of the century. But we'll have a couple questions and then we can have some treats. Does anyone have a question? Hang on, because we are live on Library Channel 20.
How did you come to be involved in helping this club develop this drink?
Oh, the Clinton Street Social Club. Oh, well, I was just friends with the owner, and I just thought it was it's actually not quite trending yet in the country, using vinegar. They're called drinking vinegars, is another kind of broad category for all of these drinks. And so they are a really good kind of sit-in for, we always put lemon juice or lime juice into cocktails, but this is another way to do that. But you can preserve fruit in vinegar, and so you can get a ton of different flavors. You can use strawberry or blueberry or throw in mint and basil, infuse it for a couple of weeks, and then you can use that in cocktails. So I just thought it would be interesting for us to start doing that here in Iowa City. I heard about it in the East Coast and the West Coast, so I thought we should start it here in the Midwest.
Kind of everything old is new again.
Yeah, it's true.
Do we have any other questions? No? No other questions? All right, well, can you tell me who the recipes are? Stacy, yours is Mrs. Shimmick's. Can I get you to?
So it's Mrs. Shimmick's lemon cake, and she was married to, I'm not going to say his first name right, Bohmil Shimmick, the ecologist, who is a famous Iowa Citian, and she was Czechoslovakian, as was her husband. So this would be a lemon cake that their family would have enjoyed.
I made sweet apple pickles. The recipe was from Mrs. C.A. Snyder. And the other recipe that I made was pork cake, and that was from Mrs. Hattie Stevens' kitchen. So,
Hi, I'm Teresa, and I was curious about the inclusion of the recipe for dates. And of course, dates don't grow in this area, and like coffee or oysters, it's a luxury item. I remember when they had the almonds in the Lincoln cake, that made it very fancy because at that time, the almonds came clear from Spain. So anyway, there are some very good quality dates with some nuts in them, which would be sort of a natural treat. And so that was my contribution tonight. It's in the cookbook, and they roll the dates in sugar, in case your dates aren't sweet enough.
All right, so come on back, try the recipes, and then make sure you go home and look at these recipes, because I know you're going to want to try some.